Go.
Okay, hi. So I was recently reading St. John of the Cross's Ascent of Mount Carmel, book 1, chapter 4, and I came across the following. So I'm going to read these sort of two quotes. The first part says, "Any soul that makes account of all its knowledge and ability in order to come to union with the wisdom of God is supremely ignorant in the eyes of God and will remain far removed from that wisdom. For ignorance knows not what wisdom is, even as St. Paul says that this wisdom seems foolishness to God. Since in the eyes of God, those who consider themselves to be persons with a certain amount of knowledge are very ignorant." The second quote, a little later, goes on to say, "If any man among you seems to be wise, let him become ignorant, that he may be wise, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God." So that in order to come to union with the wisdom of God, the soul has to proceed rather by a knowing than by knowing. So in my mind, obviously, so he's talking about knowledge and how basically we need to let go of knowledge to come to union with God. And in my mind, obviously, there's a knowledge which we have from spiritual life, which, for example, knowledge that St. John of the Cross himself gives us in his books, St. Teresa of Avila. And I would imagine it's certainly not that knowledge, because that's knowledge you need for the spiritual journey, and I have my thoughts. Is the knowledge that he's talking about sort of knowledge of sort of our understanding of God that sort of somehow needs to be purified? I guess what the core of my question is, what exactly is this knowledge that we have to sort of let go to ultimately come to union?
Okay, thank you, Rufaro, for your question. Yeah, again, for whoever is interested, the quotes are in book 1 of Ascent of Mount Carmel, and the quote is in chapter 4, paragraph 5, essentially. And the thought is well present in the general teaching of St. John of the Cross, more specifically book 2 rather than book 1. Now, why is St. John of the Cross here and in other places? I say the entire structure of book 2 is based on that. Is he seems to promote the sort of lack of necessity of not knowing God in order to draw closer to God himself. So now it's important to understand the context. What he is working on is to, first and foremost, to lead the person to union with God. So what he wants us to realize is union and a fullness of union. Union means connection between us and God. The connection can only happen, can only occur through the theological acts, the act of faith, the act of hope, and the act of love. But in the thought of St. John of the Cross, it's not enough to make an act of faith, for instance. It's important to seek the purity of faith, the purity in the act of faith, in doing or making the act of faith. And by purity, he means, so I'm trying to convey his thoughts. He means that there is no intermediate between us and God. And in the second book of Ascent of Mount Carmel, starting from chapter 11 onward, he takes different examples of possible knowledges or graces of knowledge that we can receive from God, mainly about God. And strangely, maybe for us, he almost constantly rejects all these knowledges, lights, communications from God or from whoever, you know, spiritual life. So it can be the devil, it can be other sources. He constantly rejects them because he's teaching us to make a pure act of faith. And for him, the pure act of faith means like surrendering totally to God, but considering that God is beyond our grasp. Any knowledge that falls in the soul, in the mind, in the conscious mind, is created. That's the fundamental point for him. Remember the drawing I always use, which is the spirit above the clouds, and below the clouds we have the mind, the emotions, and the senses. For him, anything that falls from above the clouds to the area below the clouds, be it in the mind or in the emotions or in the senses, not only the mind but the rest, cannot be used as an intermediate, as a ladder to allow us to access God directly. The act itself to access God needs to leave aside any knowledge or any even palpable grace that one received, in order to have that openness. He calls it the abyss of faith. I'm quoting here, for instance, among many other quotes you can find, chapter 29 in book 2, which I usually comment in the course Solid Foundations when I explain the prayer of the heart, paragraph 4, 5, and 6. He recommends that in order to unite myself right now, I don't need to wait for union. Right now, with an act of faith, my mind is united with God. But in order to do that act of faith purely, according to John of the Cross, I cannot lean on a knowledge or a light that I received. I need to, in a way, to throw myself in the abyss, to open myself totally to God. Why? Because when the mind accepts not to know, which means accepts not to receive any crumbs that fall from God, from the beyond the clouds, in the conscious mind, when the mind takes the route of not receiving or not accepting or not grasping, not wanting to sort of idolize these crumbs that fall, the openness of the mind allow the act of faith, the purity of the act of faith, it means it allows a deeper knowledge. Now, where does this is a key question here, where does this knowledge fall? It falls in the spirit, not in the soul. The spirit is above consciousness. We don't have access directly to the spirit. It's like when we receive communion. Do you see anything? This is what he's saying. When you receive communion, don't try to see. This is in fact what he's saying. So reception of communion is in fact involves a direct connection with the very nature of God, which is uncreated, which is beyond the grasp of anything that can fall in the conscious part. So he wants us to have an attitude of faith, which means openness, to allow the spirit to receive that communication without any interference from the conscious part. This is why he says, in order to draw closer to God, we need not to seek or to lean on anything that falls in the conscious part. We need to have that openness. He calls it again the abyss of faith, which means the immensity, the immense openness of the act of faith. Openness, in fact, to what is above consciousness, to the direct communication between God and our spirit. Let me take another example. Let us think, for instance, of when the time when we do some adoration or prayer of the heart. What is happening? What is happening here is an act of faith, is an act of surrendering. When I offer myself, it's more than faith, it's total faith. What is happening in this fact of giving myself? My spirit now is in the hands of God, so God can nourish it by his own nature, his own uncreated being. Feed it, feed it, feed it, and transform it. Am I aware of this? No. Some crumbs might fall? Yes. Should I be careful not to try to run after them? Yes. This is what he's trying to say. Keep this openness, because otherwise, if you see anything, or if you sense anything, or if you understand anything, you will run after it thinking that this is God. While in fact, it might be coming from God, he says, chapter 29. He says, yeah, good, but that's not God himself. It's a crumb, which means something created that falls in the conscious part. This is why he says, in order to go to God, think faith, think communion, think prayer of the heart. In order to go to God, in order to allow that connection to happen, I need not to go by seeking any knowledge and leaning on it in order to be in the arms of God, but rather not knowing. Synonymous of this for him is act of faith, purity of the act of faith. Over to you.
Okay, so I mean, you mentioned communion, which is sort of which I guess is sort of linked to prayer of the heart. I mean, the other, the scriptures and Lectio Divina are also together with communion and then prayer of the heart, sort of the two main engines sort of towards union. So how do you square that up with Lectio? Because Lectio is working primarily in the conscious part. So, because you need it to work there to understand, etc. So how does that fit in with sort of what you're saying in terms of unknowing?
Thank you. Now, despite the fact that St. John of the Cross, is extremely adamant on the rejection of any perception, if you want, or knowledge, it doesn't mean that this advice should be applied in other areas, for instance, Lectio Divina or daily life. Now, let us understand what it means. Prayer of the heart or communion are moments that are by definition unitive, or they imply direct union, immediate union with God. They don't have other goals. When I receive communion, it's meant normally to feed the deepest part of my being, all my being, but more specifically my entire being, the spirit, the beyond awareness. The same applies for the prayer of the heart. Same logic, same purpose, etc. Now, is this everything about life? Is this everything about our daily life? Is this everything about our spiritual life? No. So the danger is to apply this doctrine to other areas that would be extremely damaged if we apply this, because it would mean that we lose complete control of our being. We don't have any guidance. We don't listen to any guidance. We are just like people without any brain. We're not using our conscious part, which is not correct. It would mean that the first part of the Mass disappears completely. The Mass is only the receiving the Eucharist and full stop. Or the Mass is only the second part of the Mass. So the first part doesn't exist. So God doesn't talk. When he became incarnate, the first part of his public ministry, which is teaching, it disappears completely. That's not at all the intention of St. John of the Cross. And by the way, in chapter 26 and 31 of Ascent of Mount Carmel, he gives an exception to some types of knowledges or understanding, and he considers them of being union. But I would like to go further, since you're asking about, in fact, two other moments needs the guidance. First of all, the first part of the Mass, which is Lectio Divina, which corresponds to the first part of the ministry of the Lord, the 3 years. He's teaching, 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 and the teaching is very important because the teaching talks to our conscious mind, and we need that knowledge that transforms us. So when Son of the Cross says, in order to have a connection with God, direct connection with God, we should reject any knowledge and we should go toward God without any knowledge, this applies specifically to certain areas: prayer of the heart, communion, adoration. Any moment during the day I want to sort of connect directly with God, of course I need to use that, because here the goal is to connect directly with God. But now the goal of Lectio Divina is to know the God's will with my conscious part in order to put it into practice. I am not just a spirit, I'm also a soul, and an intellectual soul, emotional soul, and I have a body, and I have a life, I have duties of state, I have a work, a job, etc. So I need guidance for that. So any instructions, catechesis or adult formation, any activity of the type of Lectio Divina, any knowledge or culture that touches in any area in our Christian life, and more specifically in our spiritual life, is absolutely needed. Why? Because it helps us to guide ourselves, to govern ourselves every day and know what to do, what not to do. So this knowledge doesn't always have as a goal to connect us with God. Even a teaching on the purity of the act of faith, John of the Cross is giving it. So we need to learn, we need to read. You see, so guidance in spiritual life, culture, reading, and instruction, formation, this is necessary, and he's not against it. Absolutely not. Because he's talking specifically about prayer of the heart. Any activity today of Lectio Divina, which he personally had the Bible all the time in his hands and meditated on it, and we could see it in his writings, he's essentially quoting the Bible. So any Bible, any Lectio Divina activity, and I recommend reading chapter 26 and 31st in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, book 2, where he opens that window. This is the unique window he opens to these substantial knowledges that come from God, and he says they are union. Okay, so definitely it doesn't apply to other activities. It applies only to the direct access to God. This advice is meant for knowing God, entering in direct contact with God, spirit to spirit, or his very nature with our spirit.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. No, thank you for adding a lot more clarity to that. I think I get it now. I'll certainly read chapter 26 and 31 of book 2, and then I'm sure that'll also add more clarity to it. So yeah. Thanks a lot for that. I appreciate it.
It is true that in the paragraph you chose, which is in fact the paragraph we are studying in the course of St. John of the Cross, in the book we are studying, the chapter we are studying, chapter 4, paragraph 5. It is true that he's talking about this, but it is important also to know that this, what is said here very shortly in paragraph 5, is developed throughout book 2. So you have an entire book who is where he is constantly repeating this same idea, which is you want to go to God, you need to go with less knowledge more than more knowledge. You need to activate the act of faith and do it in a pure way. And pure way means rejecting any other knowledge, or even sometimes he says knowledges even that come from God. He said you need to leave that aside, and he explains why. It's not just his opinion, like an order he gives. He explains point by point why he says that, and I think the explanation is good. So why I'm saying this, it's because it is shortly addressed here, not enough. Even the quotes could divert our attention, etc. People could think of even other books like The Cloud of the Unknowing, etc. But I do recommend whoever wants to deepen exactly your question, rather not to lean on book 1, but rather on book 2. These are two complete different levels, even though it's book 1, 2, and 3. But book 1 is like a certain level, book 2 and 3 is another level. So I think it's important also to know that it's all there in book 2, and we will hopefully address it in the course on St. John of the Cross.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much.